Hey, my name's Andrew Pickett, School Finance and Accounting, Spring 2014. For my independent study, I decided to do an exercise in exploring correlation between property value in a school district and student performance in that school district. The purpose of this exercise was, in general, for me to form a better understanding of how Wisconsin distributes its aid to schools. It is something that I had very little background knowledge in coming into this course, and something that I wanted to get better at and gain a better understanding of. More specifically, this exercise was meant to explore the connection between property value and performance of students. Going into the project, I had the belief that schools with more property value per member would in fact have higher report card scores from DPI. An additional purpose is I wanted to identify any outliers, any schools that did not fit in that category, and explore those schools a little bit further. A little bit of background: I'm using the DPI school report cards. Those measure student achievement or student performance, test scores, things like that. Measure student growth, any sort of achievement gaps between different types of learners, post-secondary readiness, and student engagement. I did not use any districts that only had one school in it. I felt it was better to get a better look at an entire district, and I thought that would be more of an indication of how that district is being affected by the property value or the formulas that the state uses for equalization aid. My top performing schools, I looked at 15 of those. Scores of 73 to 100 indicate schools that exceed expectations or significantly exceed expectations. And though the minimum score to earn the exceeds expectations label is 73, I chose to use a minimum score of 80 for my top performing schools. My low performing schools, I looked at the 10 lowest performing schools according to the report cards. Those are labeled meets few expectations is from 52 to 63, and does not meet expectations is from a score of 0 to 51. Again, the main things that I looked at were property value per member versus the DPI report cards. I also looked at, I gave a quick look at suspension rates, the percentage of students who get suspended, just so I could get a quick glimpse at the discipline issues that each district might be experiencing. This is the data on the school that I collected. Again, I looked at property value of the entire district. I looked at the number of members in each district, the property value per member, and the school district report card score. I also looked at all of the schools' mill rates to see if there was anything interesting, anything worth exploring there. At a brief glance, I didn't notice any indication that mill rate had any sort of connection with performance at all. I saw various schools with low mill rates score well or score low. High mill rates also were scoring high or scoring low. And I know that studies have been done to talk about the correlation between mill rate and performance, whether or not a school is getting, or a district is getting, a good bargain on their school or not. I chose not to focus on mill rate as much for this project. I also looked at the amount that a district was going to under levy, or in many cases over levy, to see if that would be significant to some of the specific districts I looked at. And while I didn't focus so much on this part of my data, I did notice a few things that would maybe be worth looking at. For instance, one school, Menominee Indian, is a school that is performing pretty poorly on the district report cards. They have a fairly low property value per member, and they've got a great deal of suspension rate, and they are under levying by over $1.1 million. So I thought that school would probably be worth examining in another study. However, I did not look closely at Menominee Indian in that particular data. And my final column over here is the suspension rate per school, which again I felt was significant enough to at least mention. But the majority of my presentation will focus on property value per member as it's connected with school district report card. Briefly though, here are those suspension rates that I looked at in all schools that I examined, the 15 schools that exceeded expectations. The average suspension rate was 1.1% of the student body that had been suspended in the years 2012, 2013. And versus the schools that met few or no expectations that I looked at had an average suspension rate of 7.2%. Again, it's an average of, a small scale, the small sample that I looked at, that's still 7 times more likely that a student was suspended in one of these schools that did not meet expectations. And I mentioned this in some of the districts that I look at closely, but again, I think this would be worth further examination to examine, some social issues and disciplinary issues that are going on in these districts. So, quick numbers at a glance. I want you to notice this schools with less than $500,000 per member averaged a score of 60 on the report card, and schools with more than $500,000 per member averaged a score of 79 on their report card. I should mention that the majority of these schools with less than $500,000 per member, most of them were in the $300,000 to $400,000 range per member, and in this category, schools with more than $500,000 per member, most of these were in the $800,000 and above range. If we disaggregate the data a little bit more and look at each of these intervals separately, again, you see a huge increase in district performance once you get into that $600,000 per member range. We get a drastic increase, and that increase pretty much stays up throughout each of these other intervals. When we disaggregate the data like this, it's a little bit easier to identify some of the outliers. Of course, this interval sticks out, the 2 to 2.1 million per member, the $1.4 to $1.5 million per member, and the $800,000 to $900,000 per member interval is significantly lower than the others too. So I looked at which schools fell in these intervals and tried to identify each individual district that had a high property value per member versus a low district report card score. The first one that I took a look at was Birchwood Public Schools. It's a remote area in northern Wisconsin. The town has a population of 442. Their property value per member is $2,200,000, which was the second highest on my list of schools. Their school report card score was 61, which means that they met few expectations. You'll notice that they received only $62,000 in state general aid. They also qualified for $15,000 in high poverty aid. Their tax levy was $2.8 million, which accounted for 97% of the school's revenues. So what I found interesting was a school with such a high property value could have such a high percentage of free and reduced lunch, students who receive free and reduced lunch. I think typically, again, going back to my hypothesis that schools with higher property values would perform better, which was mostly true. I didn't stop to consider some of these rural schools who would have such a high percentage of free and reduced lunch. You can see that their suspension rate was 0%, so I couldn't say that the discipline is much of an issue at this school. However, the fact that they are performing so poorly and receiving very little aid from the state was, I thought, significant enough to examine a little bit closer. Second school that I looked at was Suring. This again is another remote area in northern Wisconsin. A population of 544. Property value per member in this case was 1.4 million. Their school report card score was 62, which was comparable to Birchwood. They received a little bit more in state general aid. They've got $268,000 in general aid, and they gained $25,000 in high poverty aid. This was the first year that they qualified for high poverty aid. In previous years, they had been hovering around the 49% of their student population with free or reduced lunch. And state law indicates that a school needs to have to be above 50% of 50% of their student population needs to be qualified for free or reduced lunch for 2 years in order to qualify for the high poverty aid. So this district 3 years ago only had 49% of their student population qualify for free or reduced lunch. So they had to wait until this year to actually qualify for that high poverty aid. Their tax levy was $4.1 million. This makes up for 93% of their school's revenue. Suspension rate was 5.6%, which is, compared to the average of the other schools that I looked at, significant enough to, I think, be cause for concern and an area for closer examination. The last school that I'm looking at is White Lake. Again, this is a remote area in northern Wisconsin. We've got a population of 363. Their property value per member is $841,000. School report card was 57. This is the second lowest in Wisconsin, just behind Milwaukee. They received $464,000 in state general aid, $11,000 in high poverty aid. Their tax levy makes up 83% of their school's revenue. Yet again, this school had 74% of their student body that qualified for free or reduced lunch. And considering the demographics, they underlevied by $20,000. I'm guessing, property taxes are a major concern for this community, and while they can't afford to underlevy by much, I'm sure any little bit helps them. I would imagine that they're under pressure from the community to keep those tax rates as low as possible. So my conclusions after looking at these three outliers, obviously all of them were in remote areas in northern Wisconsin, which I think is, they're areas that can often be forgotten about. Certainly I didn't think about them as I began this project. I wasn't expecting to focus on those small rural towns. Having taught in more urban areas, Minneapolis, Milwaukee, Beloit, I typically focus on the larger school districts, the urban education, and this project was pretty eye-opening to some of the significant issues that are being faced by these small rural communities. And given my background, I grew up in a small rural community, and so it's made me think about maybe getting in touch with my roots a little bit more and focusing on some of these small rural areas that are really struggling to produce successful students, or at least success is determined by our report cards. Another possible conclusion as I look at these particular districts, I think it's clear that there's large areas of land that are driving up the property value of these districts. So whether it's farmland, whether it's hunting land, vacation, tourist attractions, these are comparing the property value versus the students, the percentage of students who are receiving free or reduced lunch. I think it's clear that the majority of the school's students come from families that need some help. Now, whether that requires a complete overhaul of the equalization aid formula is debatable. I personally think that we could keep the existing formula, but we can also consider some exceptions. We can look at some of these schools who are significantly struggling, and we can find out, we can look closely and see what it is we can do to help them. It's in the small sample that I looked at, it was pretty easy to identify some of these schools that fall into this category, and I think we could probably make some exceptions and dip into the state fund and see if a little bit more help from the state could make an improvement. That would require further analysis of the community and its demographics, and see if there are other underlying issues going on that perhaps state aid would not fix, that perhaps could be fixed without it. If we'd look at other rural schools with similar demographics that are actually performing much better, we could possibly get ideas from them and try to help out these schools that way. But I don't think it's too much to ask to take a closer look at the schools who fall specifically into these categories, and at least consider some extra attention to try to help them out and to try to raise the performance of the schools to make sure that they still exist in the future. So in conclusion, I just want to say that the project has been eye-opening for me. It's something that's gotten me to consider, number one, how the state actually distributes aid. I've been able to become a little bit more familiar with that process. And I also, as somebody who's going to be looking for a job as an administrator really soon, it's really made it clear that I need to understand this stuff so I can understand what type of community I'm entering, where are their priorities, and financially, how can we put these kids in position to succeed, considering how the state distributes its money. So I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Thanks for watching.